Alright folks, tonight we're kicking things off with the absolute madness that was the Roman Colosseum. This wasn't some polite sporting arena. This was a place where the rulebook got tossed out with yesterday's garbage. Lions were perpetually hangry, and subtlety got thrown into the pit right along with the prisoners. Before you get too comfy in your seat, do me a solid, smash that like button if you're enjoying this, and hit subscribe, but only if you're genuinely digging what we're doing here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always get a kick out of seeing our global audience tuning in. Now, let's set the mood, dim those lights, maybe crank up a fan for some ambient white noise, and settle in as we take this wild ride together. The Colosseum wasn't built for fair play. It was engineered for pure spectacle, and let's be real, probably gave emperors a great excuse to avoid doing their paperwork. Today we've got soccer stadiums. The Romans? They built stadiums for organized chaos. If you walked in expecting anything resembling fairness, you'd be more disappointed than someone who brought a picnic to a hurricane. The crowd wasn't there to see balanced competition. They wanted to see people eat dirt in the most dramatic way possible. Bonus points for flailing limbs and Oscar-worthy death faces. Let's cut the BS. Roman entertainment was hardcore. Sure, you'd get the occasional evenly matched gladiator duel, but let's talk about the real crowd pleasers. The opening acts featuring criminals, prisoners, and poor schmucks who picked the wrong senator to owe money to. These guys got handed the ancient equivalent of a spork and told to make it entertaining. And entertaining they made it. The Colosseum wasn't just a venue, it was civic therapy. Life in Rome was stressful, what with plagues, food shortages, and the occasional citywide barbecue. Watching someone else have the worst day ever in a controlled environment? That's how people coped, and the best part? It was free. Funded by the emperor as a giant Please Like Me campaign, you got free bread, a seat, and front row tickets to watch someone outrun an angry elephant. What more could you want? Even the architecture screamed inequality. Emperor gets the VIP box, senators get cushions, and everyone else gets a sun-baked stone bench with a side of heat stroke. The people in the arena? They got an audience. Fairness wasn't just low priority. It wasn't even on the menu. This wasn't some gentleman's fencing match. This was Rome's version of dinner theater. If your dinner came with deep-fried dormice and the show ended in screaming. If you were fighting, they didn't measure you by your win-loss ratio. They measured you by how loud the crowd roared when you face-planted into a net. Nothing says public service like forcing some random baker to fight a professional killer in front of 50,000 screaming strangers. The Romans had a word for this entertainment. And while we've got game shows and cooking competitions today, they preferred their fun with higher stakes and fewer rules. Enter the classic pro versus schmuck matchup, where a trained death dealer squared off against, say, a pastry chef holding a sword for the first time, or some mid-level bureaucrat having an existential crisis. These weren't accidents, they were carefully planned. Sometimes the amateurs volunteered, questionable life choices. Sometimes they were convicted criminals, and sometimes they were just guys who really should have read the contract's fine print. Gladiators, contrary to Hollywood, weren't all enslaved nobodies. Some were volunteers, some were celebrities, all were highly trained. They lived in specialized schools, had coaches, and were basically pro athletes, just with more armor and fewer sneaker endorsements. Now imagine pitting one of these killing machines against some poor bastard who learned swordplay by watching shadows on a wall. The outcome was predictable, and that was the whole point. This wasn't about suspense, it was about spectacle. The crowd didn't want a fair fight. They wanted to cheer for the obvious winner while pretending the other guy had a chance. It was like watching a squirrel try to parallel park a chariot. For the amateur, they had options. Option 1. Survive long enough to be mildly impressive. Option 2. Survive long enough for the crowd to pity you. Option 3. Take a dive so spectacular the audience loses it, and the emperor nods approvingly. If you were particularly charismatic or dramatic, you might even earn a stay of execution. Romans loved an underdog story, especially if the underdog was bleeding just the right amount. But let's be real, most outcomes were decided before the match started. The crowd knew it, the fighters knew it, even the janitors sweeping up the sand knew it. Let's say you committed a crime in ancient Rome. Maybe you stole something. Maybe you looked at the emperor's statue a bit too long. Maybe your neighbor just really hated you. Congratulations, you've just qualified for a special appearance in the Colosseum. And by special appearance, we mean you'll be making intimate acquaintances with some very hungry lions. The damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was Rome's solution to everything from petty theft to treason. Toss the accused into the arena, open the gates, cue the screaming. These weren't your average zoo lions either. They were imported from North Africa and treated like A-list performers. They got better transportation than most citizens and sometimes better meals. The prisoner? They got a tunic and a growing sense of impending doom. No armor, no weapons, maybe a stick if the organizers were feeling generous. Because nothing says fair trial like handing someone a twig and telling them to make it look good. This wasn't a fight, it was a message. The Empire didn't just punish you, it turned your execution into primetime entertainment. The more dramatic your final moments, the louder the crowd cheered, the bigger the Emperor smiled, and the more everyone forgot their rent was due. And yes, people brought their kids, because why visit the playground when you can teach Junior valuable life lessons like don't commit fraud or you'll be cat food? Sometimes the condemned actually surprised everyone. They'd dodge, climb, or play dead so convincingly the lion lost interest. Unfortunately, the crowd never did. They made sure the show went on. If you're thinking this seems excessive, the Romans would have agreed, but only if you suggested removing the lions, because that would ruin the aesthetic. So let's say the lion act wraps up and the crowds had their fill of watching unarmed prisoners meet fate. What's next? Naturally, let's arm some people and send them back in, but with more animals and weirder ones. Enter the Venations, Rome's version of man versus wild, if the wild was pissed off and the man was wearing gladiator flip-flops. These were staged hunts where specially trained fighters, whoever wasn't busy that afternoon, were given weapons and told, try not to look terrified. The Colosseum would transform into a fake wilderness, prop trees, imported sand, maybe some shrubbery if the budget allowed. Then they'd release the animals, leopards, bears, ostriches, rhinos, crocodiles, basically anything that could stomp, charge, or thoroughly confuse an audience. Fighters were expected to battle them with spears, nets, or in some cases absolutely nothing useful. There are stories of men sent in with slings or sticks, about as effective as yelling "bad dog" at a charging boar. Here's the twist, it still wasn't fair, just unfair in the opposite direction. Sometimes the animals were sick, drugged, or starved to make things manageable. Other times they were just dumped into chaos, unsure if they were supposed to attack or audition for a tragedy. Not that it mattered. The goal wasn't survival, it was spectacle. Did the crowd care about the animals? Not really. If a rhino launched a guy into the stands like a lawn dart, they cheered. If the guy somehow won, they cheered louder. There were no losers, just entertainment. Sometimes the animals even teamed up. In one account, a bear and lion apparently ignored the humans and started fighting each other. The crowd ate it up, figuratively. The event planner probably got promoted. This wasn't hunting. It was what happens when an empire gets rich enough to invent new hobbies and bored enough to turn the food chain into improv theater. By now the Colosseum had established its brand. Take something brutal and make it bizarre. But when they wanted to really wow the crowd, they dipped into mythology. Because why simply execute someone when you can recreate a legend while doing it? This delightful tradition was called fatal charades, not a game show, but a form of public execution that blended storytelling with creative sentencing. Picture this nightmare scenario. Some poor soul strapped into makeshift wings, dressed as Icarus, and shoved off a platform to his death. Did he fly? Obviously not. Was it subtle? About as subtle as a volcanic eruption. The Romans absolutely adored their mythology, gods, heroes, tragic endings, the whole dramatic package. So instead of quietly disposing of criminals, they turned executions into full-blown mythological reenactments. The audience wasn't just witnessing justice, they were watching performance art. State-sponsored, blood-soaked performance art. Take the Prometheus myth, for example. In the original tale, he's chained to a rock while an eagle snacks on his liver daily. The Colosseum version? They skipped the rock, but kept the eagle, and that part was very much real. Or consider Orpheus, the tragic musician who tried rescuing his wife from the underworld. The Roman interpretation? Some poor schmuck in a tunic carrying a harp walks across the arena, until they quietly release a few very confused but very hungry predators. Spoiler alert, it didn't end with a beautiful ballad. The crowd naturally loved this macabre theater. Finally, culture and entertainment all wrapped in one bloody package. You could feel sophisticated for recognizing the mythological references while still getting to laugh when the guy in the Apollo wig tripped over his own sandals. Were these performances accurate to the original myths? Not even close. But historical fidelity wasn't the point, spectacle was. If they remembered the basic plot, great. If not, they'd just invent a new version where Hercules loses a foot. Let's be crystal clear, these weren't plays with actors. The performers weren't trained thespians. They were condemned prisoners expected to participate in their own mythological demise before taking their final bow in the afterlife. No curtain calls, no standing ovations, just a satisfied crowd feeling slightly more cultured after watching someone get Zeused off a scaffold. Just when you thought the Colosseum couldn't possibly get more extra, Rome said, "Hold my wine," and turned the whole arena into a lake. That's right. At various points in its early history, the Colosseum hosted mock naval battles called naumachii. Because when you've already turned executions into theater, the next logical step is to simulate an entire naval war in a building that's nowhere near the sea. Roman engineers, clearly both brilliant and slightly unhinged, figured out how to flood the arena floor with actual water. Not symbolic water, the kind that makes boats float and inexperienced sailors panic. The setup was simple in theory. Flood the place, toss in some ships, and stage a battle using people who often had about as much sailing experience as your average desert nomad. Sometimes these mock battles recreated famous sea battles from history. Other times it was just random groups of prisoners told row, fight, and try not to look like you've never seen in or before. Let's talk about those boats. They were obviously smaller than actual warships. You try fitting an entire fleet into an amphitheater, but they came fully decked out with paint, flags, and very real weapons. This meant there was excellent potential for people to fall in, get pushed in, or just jump in because it seemed preferable to whatever was happening on deck. The audience watched from above like tourists observing a floating disaster, equally horrified and delighted. Nobody cared about naval tactics. They wanted to see people fall off boats in spectacular fashion. Bonus points if someone screamed something poetic on the way down. There were definitely moments of drama. Ships colliding, fighters leaping between decks, people accidentally stabbing their own teammates. Honestly, it was less about naval strategy and more like drunken boating with weapons and costumes. Eventually, the Colosseum stopped these aquatic spectacles, probably because constantly flooding an ancient concrete structure isn't great for its long-term health. But for a glorious while, Romans got their sea battles, their splashing, and their laughs. Even if half the participants couldn't swim and the other half couldn't steer. Sometimes, even staged combat wasn't dramatic enough for Roman tastes. That's when the organizers broke out the real party favors: blindfolds, shackles, ridiculous mismatched weapons, and a complete disregard for physics or human dignity. Why? Because fairness is boring, but watching someone flail around blindfolded? Comedy gold, for everyone except the blindfolded guy, anyway. One popular twist involved taking a perfectly competent fighter and stacking the odds against them for entertainment value. Remove their armor, give them a comically short weapon, or, my personal favorite, hand them something utterly useless like a net, or, even better, a wooden sword. Nothing boosts confidence like stepping into an arena armed with what's essentially a child's toy. Then there were the shackles. Fighters sometimes got chained by the ankles, wrists, or both. Because clearly if you've trained your whole life to survive armed combat, what you really need is to be physically restrained while doing it. Makes dodging much more interpretive. Some poor souls had to fight while literally tied to another person. Imagine trying to stay alive when your partner's panic determines your footwork. One stumbles, both go down, and the crowd loses their collective mind. These gimmicks weren't used on just anyone, though. Gladiators were investments. The popular ones who drew crowds usually got spared the most ridiculous setups, unless the audience was bored and the emperor wanted a laugh. Then all bets were off. And let's not forget the classic surprise opponent switcheroo. You think you're fighting one guy when suddenly a trapdoor opens and out comes a second attacker. Or better yet, something with claws. Imagine a WWE match where the floor randomly spits out a bear. Ancient Rome did that, but completely unironically. None of this was in any rulebook, because there were no rules, just a checklist. Is it entertaining? Is it absurd? Can we clean it up before the next match? You might assume the Colosseum gave its audience breathers between events. Time to stretch, grab some snacks, maybe discuss the gladiator fashion choices. Technically, there was an intermission, but in true Roman fashion, even downtime became a performance. Welcome to the Meridiani, the midday break. While mornings featured beast hunts and afternoons promised gladiator duels, lunchtime was reserved for something more procedural. Public executions. Because nothing pairs with your lunchtime bread like watching the Empire's idea of due process in action. These executions weren't spontaneous. They were scheduled, organized, and timed with the precision of a Broadway show. The condemned, usually criminals, deserters, or people who annoyed the wrong bureaucrat, were paraded out so the crowd could see justice served loudly and without red tape. Nobody expected drama. This wasn't a fight, it was a warning. Don't be like this guy, the Empire said. Also, enjoy your olives. The methods ranged from quick and clean to needlessly elaborate, especially for high-profile cases. The Romans believed justice should be efficient, theatrical, and ideally sponsored by someone in a toga. The crowd, by this point, was completely desensitized. Kids begged for better seats. Vendors hawked snacks. Nobody batted an eye. If anything, they got annoyed when it ran long. Come on, someone would mutter. We're here for the real matches. That's what makes this so absurd. Executions were just filler content, like commercials. Only instead of advertising soap, they demonstrated why you shouldn't steal any. If that sounds unsettling, that's exactly the point. The Colosseum wasn't just an arena. It was a carefully choreographed display of power. Every moment, even intermission, reminded people who was in charge and what happened to those who stepped out of line. In modern sports, referees make the calls. In the Colosseum, the final verdict came from thousands of sunburnt, overfed spectators who were probably 3 cups deep in wine. Yes, in Rome, justice was crowdsourced. After a gladiator match, the loser didn't always die immediately. If he'd fought well, or at least flailed dramatically, the crowd decided his fate. Would he live to fight another day, or become a cautionary tale about poor footwork? Enter the infamous thumbs. You've probably heard thumbs down meant death, but plot twist. Historians aren't even sure which thumb meant what. Some sources say thumbs up meant execution, like drawing a sword. Others claim thumbs down meant sheathing the weapon, mercy. Some argue the gestures weren't about thumbs at all, but vague hand waves that left gladiators wishing Romans had invented scorecards. Regardless, the crowd's reaction mattered, and they weren't shy. They came ready to cheer, boo, and shout unsolicited advice at people literally fighting for their lives. It was ancient Yelp, just with more tunics and fewer stars. A boring fighter got silence, the worst outcome. An exciting one got roars for mercy or punishment. The distinction wasn't always clear, but the volume certainly was. Some gladiators played to the crowd, cultivating fan bases. Certain fighters became celebrities. People wore carvings of them. Children reenacted their victories. If the emperor was present, things got political fast. He could override the crowd's vote, granting mercy or demanding execution based on his mood. Either way, he was reading the room like a stand-up comic, just with higher stakes and fewer jokes, depending on the emperor. So while the games seemed chaotic, they were weirdly democratic, at least for the fighters. Entertain the crowd, and you had a shot. Bore them, and well, Let's just say the crowd wasn't afraid to vote with their voices, their hands, and occasionally their half-eaten lunches. Because in the Colosseum, survival wasn't just about skill. It was about giving the people a good show and praying they were feeling generous. Among all the terrifying creatures you might face in the Roman Colosseum, lions, tigers, that one guy with a net, the humble wild boar probably wouldn't top your danger list. But in ancient Rome, pigs weren't just bacon waiting to happen. They were legitimate entertainment, and not in some cute petting zoo way. These were muscular, tusk-wielding battering rams on hooves. Nature's angry bowling balls with worse attitudes and better acceleration. Now imagine one charging at you full tilt while you're trying to look heroic in a leather skirt. Gladiators trained for many things, but pig combat strategy wasn't exactly in the curriculum. Sometimes boars got featured in animal hunts, released into the arena for fighters to take down with spears. Other times, to keep things interesting, they'd get introduced mid-combat as surprise guests. Nothing spices up a duel like 300 pounds of furious pork sprinting across the sand uninvited. Records describe one particularly aggressive boar that charged through props, ignored its handlers, and nearly plowed into the front row seats. The Romans ate it up, metaphorically. Nothing says quality public entertainment like airborne swine. If you're wondering how this qualified as entertainment, understand that unpredictability was the whole point. A lion was majestic, a tiger terrifying, but a boar? That was pure comedy, especially when some overconfident fighter underestimated it. Even emperors got in on the action, hosting themed hunts to show off their exotic animal collections, including particularly nasty pigs, just to flex their empire's resources. The fighters, meanwhile, were mostly just trying not to become tomorrow's sausage. The arena floor wasn't just ordinary sand. Beneath it lay an elaborate labyrinth of tunnels, cages, lifts, and pulleys designed to ruin someone's afternoon with perfect dramatic timing. These mechanical marvels allowed stagehands to unleash animals, props, or entire set pieces exactly when it would cause maximum chaos. Imagine you're a gladiator mid-fight, sweating under the Roman sun, about to win, when suddenly the floor opens and out leaps a panther. Not part of the match, just bonus content courtesy of the event planners. Roman organizers, yes, that was basically a job title, loved surprises. Why have a normal fight when you can turn it into an obstacle course with trapdoor lions? It wasn't just animals either. Sometimes chariots would roll out, sometimes fire pits, sometimes giant wooden structures representing mythological scenes. All designed to keep the crowd engaged and the participants thoroughly confused. You weren't just fighting your opponent. You were battling the floor, the props, and the growing suspicion that someone backstage was laughing their toga off. These trapdoors were operated by teams of slaves and workers beneath the arena, coordinating with military precision, or at least the enthusiasm of a middle school drama club. One wrong lever pull, and suddenly a bear appears in the wrong scene. Or worse, fails to appear at all, leaving two fighters awkwardly circling each other for 20 minutes. To the audience, thrilling. To the combatants, a masterclass in humility and ankle awareness. In the Colosseum, you weren't just facing opponents. You were fighting architecture, set design, and Rome's boundless creativity in surprising people with unpleasantness. At first glance, gladiator versus gladiator matches sound like the fairest part of the program. Two trained professionals, evenly matched, dueling before a roaring crowd like some ancient UFC with better costumes. But this is Rome we're talking about. Fairness was always optional. While some bouts were balanced for dramatic tension, many others were rigged faster than a chariot race. You might have a seasoned veteran with years of experience versus some terrified rookie who just figured out which end of the sword was pointy. And forget about standard weapons. Sometimes one fighter got a proper gladius and shield while the other got stuck with a net and trident. Not because it made tactical sense, but because the crowd loved variety and some event planner had a flair for chaos. These mismatches had names. The Secutor versus Retiarius, Trident Guy, being particularly popular. One fighter wore full armor and a massive helmet. The other wore practically nothing and relied on dodging for survival. Less battle of equals, More, can Speedy McBarefoot avoid becoming a pancake? Why the lopsided matchups? Because Rome loved contrast. Two identically armed fighters was boring. But pit a heavily armored tank against a nearly naked guy with a fishing net? Now that's entertainment. And if one gladiator had a growing fan base or wealthy backers, matches might be tilted in his favor, not to test his skill, but to make him look even more impressive when he won. Gladiators weren't just fighters, they were investments, walking brand names. If someone developed a signature style or winning streak, the empire leaned in. Fans bought figurines, kids reenacted their moves. The merchandise wasn't official, but it existed. Meanwhile, the losing fighter? Well, he was either forgettable or spectacularly unlucky, possibly both. Because in the Colosseum, balance was an illusion. The audience didn't come for sportsmanship. They came to see someone outmatched and, hopefully, outmaneuvered. And if the underdog somehow won? Now that was a story worth telling. The Colosseum wasn't just about swords and sand, it was about spin. Not the kind that happens when someone gets whacked in the head, but political spin. This wasn't just entertainment. It was a PR machine designed to remind everyone exactly who was in charge. Every event, every match, every oops we accidentally released two tigers moment served a purpose. Obey or else. Executions weren't just punishments, they were statements. Traitors, rebels, or people who annoyed powerful senators got dispatched publicly and theatrically, often with elaborate backstories. One day you're writing scrolls with unpopular opinions. Next day you're playing Fallen Hero number 2 in a mythological reenactment you didn't audition for. And the Emperor? He wasn't just watching. He was the star attraction, seated dead center with the best view, close enough to nod approvingly at particularly artistic decapitations. The crowd watched him as much as the action. His reactions mattered. A thumbs up wasn't just a gesture, it was a headline. Some emperors used games to gain popularity, bred in circuses. Others used them to intimidate. A public execution here, a surprise lion there, all very motivating. Even popular gladiators became political tools. Fight well, and you proved Rome's strength. Refuse to die properly, and suddenly you're a liability. Sometimes entire events were staged around political narratives, celebrating military victories, complete with reenactments and actual casualties. Impressing foreign dignitaries. Nothing says don't mess with us like a guy jumping over a hippo. The Colosseum was Rome's most violent press conference. Every splash of blood and dramatic collapse served the empire's messaging. Rome is strong, Rome is glorious, and Rome is definitely watching. With all the mismatches, trapdoors, weaponized pigs, and political overtones, why did the Colosseum last so long? Simple, Rome was addicted to spectacle. These weren't just shows. They were cultural events, political tools, social glue, and occasionally state-sponsored therapy for a civilization that desperately needed hobbies. The empire was vast, complicated, and frequently on fire, sometimes literally. But give people gladiator matches, and suddenly everything felt stable. The formula worked. A bored, overtaxed citizen might grumble about grain shortages, but give them arena seats, snacks, and front-row views of someone wrestling a panther while wearing a wig. Suddenly life didn't seem so bad. That's Empire Building 101. Distract, dazzle, repeat. Emperors loved it. Games gave them instant approval ratings. Raise taxes? Host a week-long festival. Insult the Senate? Release some flaming chariots. Need to humble a general? Cast his rival as the hero in a mythological reenactment and forget to tell him it's allegorical. The Colosseum was the original social media feed, constant updates, endless drama, a place where careers were made, enemies were erased, and your reputation could hinge on a single thumb gesture. No comment section though, just roaring approval or deadly silence, which in Rome basically counted as a downvote. But even the greatest empires get tired. Over centuries, the shows became less extravagant, the animals harder to import, the audiences harder to impress. By Rome's decline, even the Colosseum started feeling like yesterday's news. Stone and sand don't last forever, neither does public attention. Yet its legacy endured. Today we remember it not as a sports arena, but as a monument to how far societies will go for spectacle. It wasn't fair, it wasn't kind, but it was unforgettable. Because when you build a stage for 50,000 people and fill it with fire, steel, and politics, you're not aiming for subtlety. You're aiming for history. Imagine you're a farmer in ancient Ireland when April's chill still lingers in the air. You gaze across the rolling green hills and mutter to yourself, right then, time to set something on fire again. Welcome to Beltane, the Celtic fire festival that wasn't just about celebrating summer's arrival. It was about surviving it. While modern folks might slap on sunscreen and complain about the heat, your ancestors were busy stacking wood and herding livestock between two roaring bonfires. Why? Because they believed smoke could purify, protect, and maybe even impress the local spirits. In this world, fire wasn't just a handy tool. It was a living force, the original mediator between realms. Lighting it wasn't casual, it was sacred theater. The Druids, ancient Celtic spiritual rock stars, ran the show. With dramatic chants and elaborate gestures, they'd conjure the central need fire, a sacred blaze that every household would relight their hearths from. Think of it as nature's system reboot, just with more sparks and zero instruction manuals. As flames crackled, villagers would lead their precious cattle between the twin fires. Sounds excessive until you realize this was Bronze Age livestock insurance, a ritual safeguard against disease and misfortune. Want healthy calves this season? March them through fire. Hoping to conceive? Take a daring leap over the flames. Nothing says romance like mildly singed leg hair. And let's talk about the dancing, sometimes clothed, sometimes decidedly not, depending on how much mead had been consumed. Couples might jump flames together to seal their love, while solo dancers hoped to attract divine matchmaking services. Beltane wasn't just a party. It was seasonal alchemy, a fiery handshake between mortals and the other world. When the fires finally died, the embers weren't just discarded. They were scattered across fields like divine fertilizer, carrying the flame's blessing into the land itself. Now let's trade damp Celtic hills for Persia's sun-baked plains. Here, fire wasn't something you danced around. It was divinity incarnate. Welcome to Zoroastrianism, one of humanity's oldest monotheistic religions, where fire wasn't just sacred, it was cosmic truth made visible. They called it Adar, a living symbol of Asha, the universe's divine order. This wasn't your average campfire. It was basically God's customer service hotline. The fire temple stood at Zoroastrianism's heart, where white-robed priests, magi, tended eternal flames that sometimes burned for centuries. Imagine being the guy responsible for keeping a sacred fire alive through wars, droughts, and that one time your apprentice sneezed. Letting it die? That wasn't just an oopsie, it was a cosmic felony. These flames weren't static displays either. During festivals like Sada and Shaharsham Suri, entire communities lit bonfires in town squares celebrating creation and the eternal light versus darkness showdown. People would leap over flames chanting poetic gems like, "Give me your healthy glow, take my sickly pallor." Basically the ancient Persian version of a detox cleanse. Even sparks carried meaning. They were divine messengers carrying prayers heavenward while scaring off demons lurking in your spice rack. Death rituals carefully avoided letting fire touch corpses that would pollute its purity. In Zoroastrian eyes, fire wasn't something to control. It was a sacred hotline connecting mortals to the cosmic blueprint. A warm, flickering divinity check-in. Now sprint, literally, to ancient Greece where fire festivals involved less contemplation and more cardio. The torch race, or Lampodromia, was their signature event. Imagine a sacred relay where runners passed flaming batons across Athens. The goal wasn't just speed, it was keeping the flame alive. Drop your torch? Disqualified. Let it go out. Congratulations, you failed both your city and the gods. These races honored fire deities like Hestia and Prometheus, that rebellious titan who stole fire from Olympus and gifted it to humanity, earning himself eternal liver-pecking punishment from Zeus. In Greek mythology, that counts as a light slap. This wasn't just sport, it was ritual theater. By preserving the flame, Runners symbolized divine wisdom's endurance. It wasn't enough to possess fire. You had to prove you could carry it without face-planting like a drunk in Hephaestus's workshop. These weren't casual jogs either. Races often happened at night, with only torchlight illuminating temples and very confused livestock. The visual drama was intentional. The gods were watching, and you'd better make it epic. Prometheus's gift represented more than just cooking fuel. It symbolized intellect, rebellion, civilization itself. The torch races weren't just honoring a myth. They were celebrating humanity's defiant cleverness, even at divine expense. Winners received laurel crowns or small statues, and probably free olive oil because Greece. But the real prize was glory and maybe temporary immunity from godly lightning bolts. Now journey east to ancient India, where fire wasn't stolen from gods. It was a god. Meet Agni, Hindu deity of flames who doubled as heaven's postal service. His job? Deliver offerings from earth to gods via smoke signals, with perfect tracking and no lost packages. In Vedic rituals, Agni was the ultimate middleman. Any prayer worth its ghee needed fire. Not just any fire, but properly kindled flames fed with clarified butter and accompanied by Sanskrit mantras. These yajna ceremonies were so complex that priests spent lifetimes mastering them. Think spiritual pyrotechnics with more incense and fewer liability waivers. A typical yajna involved building a sacred fire pit, Havan Kund, in intricate geometric patterns aligned with celestial forces. The fire had to be born from friction, no lighters allowed. Once lit, Agni became present. You weren't watching flames, you were making eye contact with divinity. The most devout households maintained eternal fires passed down generations. Let one die? That wasn't just inconvenient. It was a spiritual five-alarm emergency. Some believed it could disrupt cosmic balance. Imagine being the guy who spilled water on a divine flame. Oops, doesn't quite cover that resume entry. Fire festivals like Lohri and Makar Sankranti carried these Vedic traditions into seasonal celebrations marking agricultural cycles. Bonfires, songs, offerings blending joy with purification. Unlike traditions that kept fire at arm's length, here it was intimate, alive, profoundly respected. Agni wasn't feared like wildfire. He was honored like family, witnessing every vow, birth, and passing soul. If Vedic India saw fire as heaven's email server, ancient Egypt viewed it as the sun god's breath itself. In the land of pyramids, fire wasn't just warmth. It was Ra's cosmic authority blazing across the sky daily. Each night, he battled chaos serpents in the underworld powered solely by celestial firepower, no pressure RA. Zooming to human rituals, while RA handled solar commutes, Egyptians celebrated with flame too. Fire symbolized purification, rebirth. Temples were designed to catch dawn's first rays in their darkest chambers like gods flipping light switches. The grandest fire ritual? The Feast of Opet, WEP Rinpet, marking the new year, a multi-day extravaganza of priests, incense, offerings, and ceremonial torches processing through streets. These weren't just for show. The fire represented Ra's rejuvenating energy returning to ward off darkness. Basically spiritual pest control with better special effects. Even funerals incorporated fire carefully, burning sacred oils while keeping flames from corpses. The rising smoke carried souls upward, if the scent pleased the gods. Bonus points. Priests maintained eternal temple flames, especially for RA and his lion-headed daughter Sekhmet, whose festivals included fire rituals to appease her destructive side, sometimes involving red beer pretending to be blood because Egyptian gods loved symbolic drama. Egyptian fire wasn't wild. It was orderly, celestial, scheduled. Every spark had a script. Now plunge into Mesoamerican jungles where fire wasn't just symbolic. It was the cosmos engine. The Aztecs, Maya, and Zapotec didn't mess around with cute festivals. They staged cosmic fire resets. The Aztec New Fire ceremony occurred every 52 years when their calendar completed its cycle. Think Y2K, but with human sacrifice. As the date approached, all fires were extinguished. People destroyed possessions, fasted, basically assumed the world might end. At midnight, priests performed a heart sacrifice on a mountaintop. Only after burning the heart and kindling new flames on the victim's chest, yes really, was the fire declared reborn. From this single spark, every hearth in the empire would relight. Fail to light it, the sun might not rise. No pressure. The Maya used fire to awaken new temples, burning offerings in central chambers to activate structures like divine housewarming parties. Kings underwent fire rituals during coronations because nothing says, "I'm in charge," like surviving ceremonial burns. The Zapotec honored their fire god Kokehani with bonfires, dances, and occasional effigy burnings, basically divine piñatas with flammable personalities. Across these cultures, fire was dialogue with gods, but also demand. It hungered for sacrifice beyond logs or incense. The smoke didn't just rise, it spoke. Now sail to Polynesia where islands, the ocean, like stepping stones of flame. Here, fire wasn't just useful, it was origin story. The volcano goddess Pele dominated Hawaiian beliefs. Not some gentle hearth keeper, but a temperamental force creating and destroying islands with lava flows. Respecting her wasn't optional, it was survival. Pele lived in Kilauea's Halimimiu crater. When it erupted, those were her footsteps reshaping land. People left offerings at craters, flowers, food, sometimes hair or nails. Because when a goddess remakes geography daily, you stay on her good side. Fire dances like Samoa's Shiva Afi, fire knife dance, originated as warrior rituals, spinning flaming blades while backflipping, basically defying every safety manual ever. It wasn't just skill, it was spiritual defiance, dancing with ancestral power. Everyday life revolved around fire, cooking in underground omo ovens, guiding souls with funeral torches. Some believed ancestors traveled on flames visible in fireflies' glow. Mishandle fire? Risk offending gods and ghosts alike. Finally, Norse cultures in frostbitten Scandinavia somehow made fire central despite the climate. Their mythology began with fire and ice colliding in Ginnungagap's void. From those sparks came the first being Ymir. The fire giant Surtur would eventually ride out during Ragnarok wielding a flaming sword to burn the world. So no pressure. Seasonal fire festivals like Yule, origin of Christmas log traditions, marked winter's end. Massive logs burned for days. Longer burn meant better luck, basically cosmic insurance paid in firewood. Midsummer bonfires celebrated light's peak when spirits wandered freely. Leaping flames promised protection and fertility, and possibly impressed your crush. Viking funerals often involved cremation. Fire purified souls, sending them to Valhalla or Folkvanger while preventing zombie comebacks. Some burials included entire ships set ablaze, because why go quietly when you can exit in a floating inferno? Across these cultures, fire became more than judgment. It was trial by combustion. From India's Sita proving purity by firewalking to medieval Europe's ordeal systems. Hold this red-hot iron. If your hand heals your innocent, flames decided fates. Zoroastrianism's Chinvat Bridge judged souls over a river of molten metal. The righteous found it warm milk. The wicked discovered divine metal has no chill. Even Aztec new fire ceremonies held the world hostage. Perform correctly or risk cosmic deletion. Fire became the ultimate truth mirror. What you brought to it, truth, guilt, devotion, is what it revealed. Whether in sacred rites or terrifying trials, fire was the soul's final exam. In ancient Egypt, paying taxes wasn't just an economic chore. It was practically a sacred duty. The pharaoh wasn't your average tax collector. He was the divine intermediary between gods and mortals. So when he demanded tribute, it wasn't seen as bureaucratic harassment. It was about maintaining Maya, the sacred cosmic order. Nothing like being taxed by a living god to put things in perspective. Money as we know it didn't exist in early Egypt. So how did the pharaoh fill his coffers? Grain, mountains of grain. The Nile's annual floods ensured bountiful harvests. And after reaping, scribes would arrive with their measuring ropes and calculation tools to determine exactly how much you owed. If your fields produced 10 sacks, you might owe 3 to the state. Evasion wasn't an option. You'd lose your land, livestock, or find yourself voluntold for a construction project. Because yes, you could pay with labor too. Those iconic pyramids at Giza, not built by slaves, but by taxpayers fulfilling their civic duties. The system was ruthlessly efficient. Scribes, the sharp-eyed accountants of their day, documented everything from wheat yields to the number of donkeys you owned. Yes, even livestock was taxable. The records were meticulous. If it moved and had value, the state wanted its cut. But there was flexibility too. During famines or poor floods, quotas might be reduced. Not out of kindness, but because dead farmers pay no taxes. Fast forward to ancient Rome, where taxation became both an art form and a source of legendary grumbling. The empire turned everything into taxable commodities: land, slaves, doors, and yes, even urine. The infamous vectigal urini, urine tax, targeted public urinals and fullers' workshops that used ammonia-rich urine for bleaching clothes. When Emperor Vespasian's son complained about this unsavory tax, the emperor held a coin to his nose. Money doesn't stink. Point made. Roman taxation was gloriously creative. Window taxes encouraged modest architecture. Inheritance taxes skimmed off estates. There was even a sales tax, though only free citizens paid it, because enslaved people were already considered taxable property. Tax collectors, publicani, were private contractors who prepaid the state for collection rights, then squeezed citizens for profit. Unpopular? That's an understatement. They made modern IRS agents look cuddly. Yet these taxes built an empire: aqueducts, roads, temples, and conquests stretching from Britain to Syria. The system worked so well it inspired revolts. Provinces groaned under tribute demands, and more than one rebellion started with taxpayers asking how much. Meanwhile, in Mesoamerica, the Aztecs ran history's most visually stunning tax system. Their tribute wasn't paid in coins, but in cocoa beans, jaguar pelts, and quetzal feathers so vibrant they'd make modern tax forms look drab. Every conquered city-state received pictorial invoices, no spreadsheets, just colorful codices, showing what they owed: stacks of maize, bales of cotton, sacks of cocoa, which served as currency. 20 beans could buy a turkey, 100 could purchase a slave. The system was brilliantly organized. Tax collectors, Calpix, carried illustrated guides, and woe to the province that delivered subpar goods. Aztec auditors didn't accept excuses. One region supplied embroidered warrior costumes complete with battle sandals. Another provided exotic bird feathers for royal headdresses. Imagine explaining to your village why this year's tax burden was 30 live parrots and 2 flawless jaguar pelts. Failure to pay triggered brutal consequences. Aztec enforcers weren't known for patience. Yet this system sustained an empire where the capital Tenochtitlan dazzled with floating gardens and markets overflowing with goods, most paid for by tributary towns. Ancient China took taxation to staggering scales. During the Han Dynasty, peasants, the empire's backbone, paid taxes in 3 forms: grain, cloth, and corvée labor. The grain filled state granaries, the cloth clothed officials, the labor built canals, roads, and occasional Great Wall renovations. Imagine tax season meaning months hauling bricks through the Gobi Desert. The Tang Dynasty introduced the two-tax system: summer and autumn payments calculated on land ownership and household size. In theory, fair; in practice, flexible according to collectors' moods. Then came China's secret weapon, the salt tax. By heavily taxing this daily necessity, the state ensured steady revenue. Salt revenues funded armies, palaces, and bureaucrats' retirements. It's no exaggeration to say salt underwrote Chinese dynasties. Census taking became an art form. Officials tracked every son, every ox, every hidden rice paddy. Excessive taxation sparked revolts like the Yellow Turban Rebellion, when farmers facing starvation still had to surrender 30% of their crop. Trouble brewed. Our tax tour begins properly in Mesopotamia, where Sumerians invented taxation alongside writing itself. Their clay tablets. Thousands survive. Record meticulous tax accounts. Barley from farmers, fish from fishermen, donkeys from traders. Yes, even donkeys were taxed. Temples doubled as tax collection centers where stern priests assessed dues. King Hammurabi's Code, one of history's oldest legal texts, prescribed tax penalties, some so severe they involved dismemberment. Try explaining that to your modern accountant. Citizens could pay in silver, labor, or bricks for public works, because nothing says civic duty like being taxed in masonry. Ancient Greece took a different approach. Athenian citizens largely avoided direct taxes. Instead, wealthy citizens performed liturgies, public services like funding plays or warships. Refuse? Your social standing plummeted faster than a Spartan's temper. Foreigners and medics, resident aliens, however, paid monthly protection fees, essentially charging them for the privilege of not being citizens. Trade taxes fueled Athens' empire. The port of Piraeus buzzed with customs officials collecting duties on everything from olive oil to pottery. Philosophers opined on taxation too. Plato advocated modest ruler taxes. Aristotle saw taxes as necessary, but warned against excess. Meanwhile, average Athenians just wanted tax collectors to stay away from their vineyards. Tax farmers, private contractors who bought collection rights, were universally loathed. They prepaid the state, then recouped their investment plus hefty profits. Unpopular? They made scorpions seem cuddly. The Inca Empire revolutionized taxation without money, markets, or writing. Their MITA system required citizens to contribute labor, building roads, farming state lands, or mining silver. You didn't pay in coins, you paid in sweat. Communities, ALIS, sent workers when called, receiving food and tools in return. Need a mountain bridge? MITA labor built it. Want 25,000 miles of roads? MITA workers paved them. The system was brilliantly adaptable. Rotating labor obligations prevented exhaustion. Hipus, knotted cords, tracked obligations in lieu of ledgers, an entire accounting system in colorful strings. When Spaniards co-opted the system for brutal silver mining, it became deadly, but originally, it sustained an empire without currency. During Islam's golden age, 8th to 13th centuries, taxation blended morality with bureaucracy. Zakat, one of Islam's 5 pillars, was a mandatory 2.5% wealth tax for aiding the poor, indebted, and travelers. More than tax, it was spiritual obligation. Non-Muslims paid jizya, protection tax, and carriage, land tax, scaled by wealth and negotiated with surprising fairness. The state's diwan, treasury, wasn't some chaotic vault, but a sophisticated bureaucracy with trained clerks and receipts. Market inspectors, mutasibs, ensured honest weights and fair pricing. Try hiding profits to avoid zakat, and you might get a Quran-quoting auditor at your door. Some rulers, like Caliph Umar, walked markets incognito, checking tax burdens weren't crushing people. The system balanced profit with piety, funding schools, hospitals, and the intellectual flourishing that later inspired Europe. Medieval European taxation made modern bills seem pleasant. The church demanded tithes, 10% of income, paid in crops or livestock. Refuse? Risk damnation. Feudal lords imposed endless dues. Pay for land, mills, ovens. Get married? Tax. Inherit land? Tax. Good harvest? The taxman cometh. England's Doomsday Book, 1086, was William the Conqueror's master tax survey, recording every pig, plow, and peasant for maximum extraction. By the 13th century, kings introduced income taxes for wars, but when the 1381 peasants' revolt erupted against a flat poll tax, rulers learned even medieval taxpayers have limits. From cocoa beans to urine, rice to forced labor, ancient taxation wasn't just economics. It was power, control, and the fragile thread between rulers and ruled. One coin, one grain, one revolt at a time. To the Vikings, death wasn't an ending. It was the ultimate adventure's beginning. Life could be fleeting and brutal, but death? That's where the real journey started. And depending on how you lived, or more importantly, how you died, you might find yourself in vastly different afterlives. The most coveted destination was Valhalla, Odin's golden hall where slain warriors feasted, fought, and prepared for Ragnarok. But getting there required dying weapon in hand, preferably while doing something spectacularly bloody. If that wasn't in the cards, there was always Folkvangr, Freya's equally prestigious realm where half the fallen went. Not quite as many had injuries there. Those who died of old age or sickness weren't so lucky. They went to Hell's shadowy domain. Note the single L. This predates Christian hell concepts. Contrary to modern depictions, this wasn't necessarily punishment, just a quieter afterlife with fewer mead halls and battle songs. With such high stakes, Viking funerals became carefully staged productions, part tribute, part spiritual navigation system, part family flex. A well-executed send-off showed respect, wealth, and social standing. A sloppy one. Recipe for hauntings, bad luck, or worse, a soul trapped between worlds. Even modest funerals included grave goods, weapons for warriors, tools for farmers, everything needed for the next life. But elite funerals? The Norse didn't do subtle. Chieftains got full ship burials with sacrificed animals, weapons, and sometimes even servants. The goal wasn't just honoring the dead. It was ensuring safe passage and cementing legacies. Because in Viking culture, being remembered meant living forever. The funeral wasn't the final chapter. It was the first page of eternity. Preparing Viking dead was serious business. Bodies were washed, groomed, and dressed in their finest, not for vanity, but as spiritual preparation. A warrior might be clad in his best wool tunic with fur-trimmed cloak, a shield maiden in embroidered dresses with ornate brooches. Jewelry wasn't just decoration, it was afterlife currency. Weapons were essential. Swords, axes, and shields weren't ceremonial props, but actual tools for the next world. Even farmers got buried with knives or tools. Utility mattered as much as status. The deceased also received journey packs, drinking horns, cooking pots, combs, and gaming pieces. Some items were ritually broken, possibly to release their spirits. Social rank dictated extravagance. Wealthier graves included horses, sledges, or even ships. Some accounts describe sacrificed servants joining their masters, brutal by modern standards, but considered an honor in Norse belief. After preparation, bodies lay in state for days, allowing communities to mourn through rituals, storytelling, and feasting, because even Vikings understood grief needs carbs. Now to the famous Viking ship burials, though Hollywood gets it wrong. Those dramatic flaming ships pushed out to sea, mostly romantic 19th century fiction. Real ship burials were land-based, either buried under mounds or burned in place. The Oseberg burial, Norway, contained an ornate ship with two women surrounded by textiles, sledges, and sacrificed animals. No flames or water. The Gokstad chieftain was buried with his ship, weapons, and 12 horses. A statement burial meant to impress gods and humans alike. That said, some cremations did use boats symbolically, either small vessels or stone outlines. Burning an entire ship took staggering resources: wood, labor, and nerves of steel. The flames purified souls while preventing unwanted returns. Vikings took zombie prevention seriously. Whether burned or buried, the care reflected their beliefs. Death was a journey needing proper supplies and respect. Grave goods reveal Viking afterlife logistics. Almost every burial included occupation-appropriate items. Blacksmiths got hammers, farmers got plows, traders got scales. Wealthier graves contained imports like Arabian silver or Frankish glass, showing off even in death. Animal sacrifices ranged from practical, food sources, to symbolic, hawks for nobility. The most striking? Horse sacrifices, sometimes multiple animals carefully arranged. Dogs, oxen, and even falcons also appear, each chosen for specific spiritual reasons. Some burials contain darker elements. Human sacrifices, likely slaves or servants. Arab chronicler Ahmad ibn Fadlan described a Rus Viking funeral where a slave girl volunteered, after much mead, to join her chieftain. a days-long ritual ending in ritual killing. While extreme, it underscores how Vikings viewed death as a continuation requiring proper staffing. Burial mounds, horg, were the Viking equivalent of billboards, massive earthworks proclaiming someone important lies here. These weren't just dirt piles, they were engineered monuments. A chieftain's mound might cover a ship or chamber tomb, layered with stones and soil. Some were turf-covered, others left bare as permanent statements. Size mattered. Bigger mound, bigger legacy. Some sites feature multiple mounds forming ship shapes or celestial alignments. Vikings were practical, but deeply symbolic. These mounds became sacred spaces for generations, sites for oaths, assemblies, and seasonal rituals. Families gathered there to connect with ancestors, creating dynastic landmarks that shaped regional identities. Even in death, Vikings marked territory. Mounds along waterways or roads served as both memorials and property claims. Not all burials were extravagant. Commoners got simpler graves, stone circles, pit graves, or cremations with basic offerings. But even modest burials showed care. Items were arranged deliberately, bodies oriented meaningfully, often east-west. Vikings believed in arming souls properly, regardless of status, a philosophy carried from fjords to foreign shores wherever they settled. The burning question, literally, was cremation versus burial. Vikings used both extensively, often side by side. Early periods favored cremation, especially in Sweden. Bodies burned on pyres with grave goods, the ashes buried or scattered in stone settings. Fire purified souls and prevented unwanted returns, a real concern in Norse mythology full of draugr, undead revenants. By the Viking Age's end, inhumation grew popular, possibly influenced by Christianity's bodily resurrection ideas. But pre-Christian inhumations also occurred, especially in Iceland and Norway, bodies buried in boats, chambers, or simple graves fully dressed. Some graves show peculiar precautions, bodies weighed down with stones, or spears piercing burial shrouds. Zombie deterrent centuries before The Walking Dead. Regional differences abounded. Coastal areas favored ship symbolism. Inland areas used stone ships. Some communities buried weapons with everyone. Others reserved them for warriors. The variations reveal a flexible belief system adapting to environments and eras. What remained constant? The conviction that death began a new existence requiring proper provisioning. Viking funerals weren't silent affairs. They featured songs, poems, and ritual toasting, many. Skalds composed eulogies recounting deeds and lineages, the original rest and power tributes. Drinking horns circulated as attendees toasted gods, ancestors, and the deceased, grief processed through mead and poetry. Some ceremonies involved ritual drama, recreating the deceased's life through symbolic acts. Ibn Fadlan describes a chieftain's funeral where warriors circled his ship recounting exploits, essentially Viking open mic night meets obituary. These performances helped souls transition while reinforcing community bonds, because even Vikings knew grief shared as grief halved. Memorial feasts, Urfi, occurred weeks later, settling affairs, redistributing possessions, and cementing legacies. New leaders might be chosen, oaths sworn, stories retold. For Vikings, remembrance equaled immortality, so they built memory into landscapes through runestones. These carved monuments turned grief into permanent art. Unlike modern headstones, runestones were public announcements along roads or burial sites. Their runic inscriptions ranged from simple, Gunnar placed this stone for his brother, to elaborate sagas in miniature. Some included curses against vandals. Move this stone, and may your crops fail, shows Viking memorials meant business. The Jelling Stones, Denmark, exemplify this. Massive runestones erected by King Harald Bluetooth honoring his parents and celebrating Denmark's Christianization. They blended pagan and Christian imagery, showing how Viking memorials evolved while maintaining cultural roots. Runestone artistry matched their messages. Some featured intricate serpent designs weaving through text, others depicted ships or crosses. The craftsmanship signaled the deceased's importance. Only wealthy families could afford such memorials. But whether simple or ornate, each stone proclaimed, this life mattered. Even after conversion, Vikings kept memorial traditions, just swapping Thor's hammer for crosses. The impulse remained. Mark lives visibly in stone rather than just memory. Because in Viking cosmology, being forgotten was the true death. Despite their pragmatism, Vikings harbored one deep fear: the dead who wouldn't stay dead. Enter the Draugr, corporeal undead with superhuman strength and nasty attitudes. These weren't ghosts. They were reanimated corpses that crushed living beings, haunted households, and generally overstayed their welcome. What created Draugr? Bad deaths, drowning, murder, bad lives, greedy, violent people, or improper burials. Some medieval texts describe Draugr as blue-black and corpse-swollen, essentially Viking zombies with anger issues. They guarded graves, attacked travelers, and caused natural disasters, because nothing ruins harvests like a pissed-off revenant. Prevention methods ranged from practical to bizarre. Bodies might be buried face down, so they'd dig downward. Heavy stones piled on graves to pin corpses down, or limbs severed, a surefire mobility hindrance. Some graves show spears driven through shrouds, just in case. Cremation helped, but some believed even ashes could reform if the spirit was vengeful enough. Not all post-mortem returns were malicious. Some dead offered guidance or protection. The Dazur, female ancestral spirits, were honored at family burial mounds, receiving offerings for continued favor. Even in death, Viking relationships remained complicated. Respect and fear often went hand in hand. This duality extended to Valhalla. Eternal glory sounds great until you realize it's endless combat with no weekends. Viking afterlife rewards still involved struggle, a cultural reflection that even paradise requires effort. Their mythology embraced cyclical conflict. Ragnarok's destruction preceded renewal, just as funeral fires enabled new beginnings. Ultimately, Viking funerals weren't about endings, they were transformations. Through fire, stone, and song, they sent souls onward while keeping memories alive. In a world where reputation was everything, a proper send-off ensured one's name outlasted mortal years, the closest anyone gets to immortality. The Viking funeral procession was anything but a quiet affair. It was a carefully orchestrated spectacle blending pageantry with raw emotion. Picture this: the deceased, resplendent in their finest armor or jewelry, being transported toward their final resting place atop a wooden bier carried by family members. Behind them, a retinue of mourners moved in solemn formation, warriors clashing swords against shields, women wailing ritual laments, children scattering flower petals along the path. The air hung thick with the scent of burning pine and the metallic tang of blood from recent animal sacrifices. At the gravesite, the real ceremony began. For wealthier Vikings, this meant an actual ship dragged ashore to serve as a burial chamber. The Gokstad chieftain's funeral would have required hundreds hauling his 24-meter warship up from the fjord, a staggering display of communal effort. The ship's hull was lined with precious grave goods, his sword with gold-inlaid hilt, a gaming set with carved pieces, even his favorite hunting dogs sacrificed to accompany him. Then came the human element. Some accounts suggest slaves were forced to engage in ritual sex before being strangled, their bodies arranged like macabre sentinels around the ship's perimeter. The burial ritual reached its crescendo as the chieftain's body was positioned amidships, propped upright against the mast as if commanding one final voyage. Workers then erected a timber burial chamber around him before piling earth over the entire structure, creating an artificial hill visible for miles. The message was clear: here lies power. For weeks afterward, mourners returned to feast at the mound's foot, pouring libations into the soil as they recounted his exploits. Because even in death, Viking chieftains needed their stories told. Contrast this with a commoner's funeral in rural Iceland. Without resources for ship burials, the family might repurpose their modest fishing boat as a coffin. After dressing grandfather in his worn but carefully mended tunic, they'd place his rusted axe across his chest and lower the boat into a shallow pit. The grave might contain just 3 items: his personal knife, a clay drinking cup, and a whetstone to sharpen tools in the afterlife. Yet even this humble send-off followed tradition. The grave aligned east-west so he could watch for Ragnarok's dawn, his face smeared with tar to deter grave robbers. At the funeral feast, relatives would deliberately spill mead on the floorboards for the house spirits, ensuring the dead remained connected to the living. The funeral pyre represented perhaps the most visceral Viking burial method. In Sweden's Birka trading hub, archaeologists have found cremation sites where temperatures reached 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt glass. Picture the scene. The body laid upon a stacked wood platform taller than a man, surrounded by sacrificed horses with slit throats. As flames consumed the structure, hired mourners circled the pyre chanting verses from the Eddas while relatives tossed in personal mementos. A daughter might sacrifice her doll, a widow her wedding brooch. The next morning, they'd sift the cooled ashes for bone fragments to bury in an urn shaped like Thor's hammer, a final protective charm against restless spirits. Ritual specialists played crucial roles throughout these ceremonies. The Gothi, priest, consecrated the grave with blood from a freshly killed rooster, its entrails examined for omens. Seeresses might go into trances, channeling messages between worlds. Even the corpse preparer held sacred status. Their role in washing and dressing the dead made them both revered and feared. One Icelandic law specifically forbade these handlers from trimming their nails for a month after contact with corpses, lest they accidentally channel death magic. The funeral's conclusion marked not an ending, but a transition. Families observed mourning periods ranging from 7 days to several months, during which they avoided loud celebrations and wore distinctive blue-dyed armbands. Memorial feasts, Shand, were held precisely 9 days after burial, a number sacred to Norse cosmology, where the deceased will was read and inheritance distributed. Particularly beloved ancestors might receive ongoing offerings. Archaeologists have found small grave windows and burial mounds through which descendants passed food and drink for years afterward. Viking funerals adapted remarkably when they encountered other cultures. In Normandy, Norse settlers blended ship burials with Gallo-Roman mausoleums, creating hybrid tombs with runic inscriptions in Latin letters. Rus Vikings trading along the Volga adopted elements of Slavic death rituals. Their graves began containing carved wooden idols alongside traditional weapons. Most strikingly, in Christianized areas like Dublin, 10th century Vikings buried their dead with crosses, while still including Thor's hammer amulets, just in case. These adaptations reveal the Vikings' pragmatic approach to death. Their rituals weren't frozen in time, but evolved to serve living communities. A Viking funeral ultimately achieved 3 goals: ensuring the deceased's comfortable transition, protecting the living from supernatural harm, and cementing social bonds through shared grief and celebration. In a world where life was harsh and unpredictable, these ceremonies provided structure, a way to channel loss into something meaningful, even beautiful. The legacy of Viking funerals persists in unexpected ways. Modern reconstructions of Norse burial ships have demonstrated the incredible engineering skills required. The Gokstad ship's replica took 40 craftsmen 2 years to build using period tools. Contemporary Scandinavian death customs still echo ancient practices. Many families keep open caskets at home before funerals, mirroring Viking, lying in state traditions. Even the popular image of Vikings burning longships at sea, while historically rare, inspired J.R.R. Tolkien's description of King Theoden's funeral in The Lord of the Rings. Perhaps most telling is how Viking funeral artifacts continue surfacing. In 2019, Norwegian archaeologists discovered a rare woman's grave with warrior goods containing swords, shields, and a full set of gaming pieces, challenging assumptions about gender roles. Each new find reminds us that for the Vikings, death wasn't merely an end, but a doorway, one they crossed with their identities intact, armed for whatever awaited beyond. The Viking funeral feast was where grief transformed into celebration, a raucous affirmation that life, however briefly, had been well-lived. Picture this scene. Long tables groaning under roasted boar carcasses, barrels of mead making their rounds, and 100 voices shouting "Scowl" as drinking horns clashed. But this was no ordinary party. Every element carried ritual significance. Every toast was a spell weaving the dead into memory's fabric. At the head of the hall stood the high seat, left empty for the deceased, a throne-like chair draped with their cloak and weapons. Guests took turns approaching it, placing offerings. A warrior might leave a newly forged spearhead, an old rival perhaps his best knife, in reconciliation. The atmosphere oscillated between tearful eulogies and uproarious storytelling, because Vikings understood that laughter and grief are two sides of the same coin. The menu itself was coated with meaning. Boar meat honored Freyr, the fertility god whose golden-bristled Gullinbursti symbolized resurrection. Round flatbreads represented the sun wheel, a promise of cyclical renewal. Even the mead mattered, brewed with honey from hives kept near burial grounds. It literally contained traces of ancestors. When mourners drank, they consumed the land's memory. Entertainment followed strict protocols. First came the grave poems, skalds reciting verses composed specifically for the occasion, their kinnings, poetic riddles, describing the dead without naming them directly. A skilled poet might weave in references to the person's childhood mishaps or that time they got embarrassingly drunk at the alting, laughter being the surest armor against despair. Then the games began, but these weren't casual pastimes. Wrestling matches reenacted the deceased's famous battles. Archery contests used targets painted with Jormungandr, the world serpent, symbolizing life's constant struggles. Most poignant was the Nefataful Viking chess tournament, the board's central king piece representing the departed, surrounded by attackers in a metaphor for life's vulnerabilities. As night deepened, the rituals grew more intense. Young warriors would take turns sitting in the deceased's high seat, temporarily channeling their spirit to offer advice, a practice walking the fine line between seance and psychological catharsis. Women circulated with memory horns, drinking vessels carved with runes that activated when touched to lips, each sip binding the dead's essence to the living. The climax came at midnight, the Blood Eagle ceremony, nothing to do with the infamous execution method. An actual eagle was sacrificed, its wings spread over the high seat, while a seeress read omens in the entrails. The feathers were distributed, kept as talismans ensuring the dead would guide their descendants' journeys, both physical and spiritual. By dawn's light, the funeral's second phase began, the inheritance redistribution. Unlike modern legal processes, this occurred publicly at the feast. The deceased's possessions were displayed. Weapons went to sons or chosen successors, jewelry to daughters, tools to apprentices. Even livestock were allocated according to witnessed oral wills, a system relying entirely on communal honor. What's often overlooked is how these feasts functioned as social reset buttons. Blood feuds could be settled over funeral mead. A sworn enemy drinking from the reconciliation horn might end generations of violence. Marriage alliances were brokered at these gatherings. Widows often chose new husbands from among proven warriors who'd honored their late spouse. Even slave manumissions occurred, with bondsmen freed to serve the deceased in Valhalla. Archaeological evidence reveals fascinating details. At the Oseberg ship burial site, soil analysis showed an area where at least 20 cattle were slaughtered and cooked, enough to feed 300-plus mourners for days. Excavated drinking horns retained traces of hallucinogenic herbs mixed with mead, suggesting some rituals aimed for altered states. Most remarkably, at Uppsala, researchers found feasting pits layered with animal bones, each stratum representing a generation's worth of memorial gatherings. The funeral feast's legacy endures in Scandinavia's modern customs. The smorgasbord buffet tradition originated from these ancestral meals. Contemporary memory books signed by funeral guests descend from runic signing stones. Even the Swedish death-cleaning trend, decluttering before dying, echoes Viking beliefs about orderly transitions. Ultimately, these feasts achieved what no stone monument could. They transformed grief from a paralyzing force into active remembrance. As the last embers died and the final scowl was shouted, the departed truly became what Vikings feared most to lose. Not dead, but remembered. And in that memory, they sailed on, beyond the horizon of mortal sight, into the saga's immortality. Not all Viking funerals were noble send-offs for warriors or beloved chieftains. Some were political theater, spectacles designed to intimidate rivals, erase enemies, or rewrite history. Imagine a defeated king's funeral orchestrated by his conquerors. His body paraded through hostile territory, his burial mound built not to honor him, but to humiliate his lineage. The stones stacked too high, the grave goods deliberately sparse, a message carved not in runes, but in absence. Archaeology reveals these shadow narratives. At Furkit, Denmark, a mass grave holds decapitated bodies, likely executed prisoners forced to attend their executioner's lavish funeral as post-mortem attendants. Their skulls were placed at the feet of the honored dead, a grisly escort service to the afterlife. Other sites show evidence of grave robbery, where weapons were systematically stripped from burial mounds, not by thieves, but by living descendants redistributing power. Even the famed ship burials carried dark undercurrents. The Oseberg Queen's funeral, 834 CE, included a young servant girl, her bones showing signs of chronic malnutrition and a broken collarbone, likely a thrall killed to serve in death as she had in life. The Gokstad chieftain's burial included 12 horses, but their uneven tooth were suggests they were stolen from multiple farms, a flex of posthumous dominance. The economics of eternity. A proper Viking funeral wasn't just spiritually significant, it was ruinously expensive. Historians estimate a mid-tier ship burial cost the equivalent of 300 cows, enough to bankrupt most families. This created a funeral aristocracy where only the elite could afford proper send-offs, while commoners made do with symbolic boat-shaped stone outlines. The pressure to keep up with the Jarls drove some to extreme measures. Icelandic sagas tell of heirs selling ancestral lands to fund funerals, or warriors going berserk in battle hoping to die gloriously, and thus secure a better afterlife. In one grotesque loophole, some families would reuse burial ships, digging up older mounds to salvage vessels for new funerals, quietly reburying the original occupants in simpler graves. The Christian reshaping. As Scandinavia Christianized, the old rituals were sanitized but never fully erased. Early Christian Vikings practiced hybrid burials, crosses carved into runestones, mead replaced with communion wine, but still poured into the earth. At Jelling, King Harald Bluetooth erected a massive runestone proclaiming Denmark's conversion, but buried his pagan father Gorm beneath it in traditional style, a political tightrope walk between old and new gods. The church fought back. By 1100 CE, laws forbade grave goods, calling them heathen vanity. Families adapted, hiding amulets in coffin linings or burying swords at midnight. In Sweden, some defiantly placed Thor's hammers in dead hands, then folded the fingers around crosses, just in case. Modern echoes. Today's Scandinavian death customs retain Viking DNA. The Swedish gravel, grave ale, and Norwegian minhost, memory harvest, are direct descendants of funeral feasts. Even the tradition of lighting candles on graves traces to older practices of lighting pyres to guide the dead. In 2020, archaeologists used ground-penetrating radar to discover a previously unknown Viking burial mound in Norway. Its outline perfectly aligned with the winter solstice sunrise. It's a reminder that these rituals, for all their brutality and beauty, were never just about death. They were maps for the living, drawn in fire and stone, insisting one immutable truth. To be forgotten is the only true death, and the Vikings, to their bones, refused to go quietly. The Viking funeral pyres may have cooled centuries ago, but their embers still glow in unexpected places. Modern reconstructions reveal the staggering logistics behind these rites. Experimental archaeologists calculating that the Gokstad ship burial required 6,000 kilograms of dry oak, while the cremation of a single chieftain demanded 1.5 tons of firewood. These weren't just ceremonies. They were feats of engineering, requiring entire communities to gather resources for months in advance. Yet beyond the spectacle lies a deeper truth. Viking funerals were never truly about the dead. They were survival strategies for the living. In a world without written histories, these rituals became living memory banks. When a ship was burned or a mound raised, it created a permanent landmark, a place where stories could be anchored, where laws were recited, where children learned their lineage. The dead became the glue holding fragile, human networks together across generations. The Last Longship. In 2019, a team of Norwegian artists and historians built a full-scale replica of the Michaelbust ship, circa 9th century CE, the largest Viking burial vessel ever discovered. For 3 years, they sourced materials using only period-accurate tools, hand-forged axes, horsehair ropes, and iron rivets smelted from local bog ore. The finished vessel measured 30 meters, longer than 2 school buses, and weighed 11 tons empty. Then came the controversial part. They burned it. Under the watch of archaeologists, the team staged a controlled cremation, documenting how flames consumed the oak hull, how smoke patterns shifted with wind, even how the ship's posture changed as structural beams collapsed. The data revealed what sagas never could, that a ship's funeral's most sacred moments weren't in the blaze itself, but in the hours afterward, as families sifted warm ashes for bone fragments. This was no mindless destruction. It was a meticulous translation of flesh into memory. Ghosts in the machine. Today's forensic science has resurrected long silent voices from Viking graves. Isotope analysis of teeth from the Orkney Islands revealed that a woman buried with a Norse sword had grown up in Normandy, proof that Viking women migrated and held status abroad. DNA from a mass grave in Dorset, England, showed executed Vikings were cousins, likely captured in the same raid. Even the stains on a warrior's teeth, from birch tar used to waterproof drinking horns, confirm saga accounts of funeral toasts. But some mysteries resist science. At Uppsala, Sweden, a 10th century burial mound holds a man, a woman, and between them, an empty space just wide enough for a child. No bones remain, only a tiny glass bead and the ghostly outline of a wooden toy. Archaeologists debate whether this was a family reunited in death or a tragic offering. The truth may be both. The echo in pop culture. From Game of Thrones funeral pyres to Assassin's Creed Valhalla's in-game ship burials, Viking death rites saturate modern media, often missing their original context. The HBO series Vikings came closest to accuracy when it depicted Ragnar Lothbrok's funeral, his body laid in a ship piled with herbs, confirmed by pollen traces in real graves, set adrift with burning arrows, a disputed but plausible method. Yet even this Hollywood version omitted the months of preparation and the economic toll on Ragnar's clan. More telling are the real-world imitators. Since 1975, over 200 people worldwide have requested Viking-style funerals, though modern laws usually limit them to symbolic burns or underwater urns. In 2020, a Scottish brewery launched Valhalla Ale, its label featuring a reconstructed Viking face based on skeletal remains. The tagline? Drink with the ancestors. The final paradox. Perhaps the ultimate irony lies in how Viking funerals defied their own purpose. The very rituals meant to ensure remembrance often destroyed the evidence. Wood rotted, ships burned, oral traditions faded, leaving only fragments for us to puzzle over. Yet in this incompleteness, we find their true legacy. The Vikings didn't fear oblivion because they built a culture where death wasn't an end, but a catalyst for stories, for art, for laws that still shape Scandinavia today. Their funerals weren't conclusions, but prologues to whatever came next. As the embers of history glow faintly in petrified amulets and rusted sword hilts, one truth remains. The fire was never just fire. The ship was never just wood. And the dead were never truly gone.